Verb. No, don't run away. It's okay. It's okay. It's not gonna hurt you. It's okay. It's okay. Come back. Come on. Come here. It's okay. It's okay. Is that a bird? Hey, everybody, including you. Welcome to Nga. When watching submissions for the cursed conlang circus over the past several years, one of the most common cursed things that people attempt to do to their languages goes something like this. This language doesn't have verbs. Yeah, I know. It's practically a mullet. Literally, like, everyone under the age of 30 out here in Spain has, like, some wild mullet and fade look. And sorry, Spaniards, I don't like that look. And so I went to a haircut place and I showed them some example photos that looked similar to what I usually do. And I was like, yeah. I mean, you could leave a little bit in the back, but I don't want a mullet. No. And I think this is the least mullety thing that a Spanish barber can conceive of. So people come at this idea of excluding verbs from many different angles, but nearly every time the language still ends up having verbs. Believe me, I tried back in the day before I started studying linguistics. One of the goals was to not have verbs, but that ended up turning into the pro word in Arodjun, which is, in common linguistics terminology, a type of auxiliary verb, or a pro word, or whatever. I've talked about it before. Originally, my thesis for this video was going to be this. Any language intended to exist in a universe structured similarly to our own will have verbs. Some languages can blend prepositions or cases with verbal concepts, and sometimes verbs can be realized as null spaces between uttered information, but they are verbs. But then, a couple weeks after the circus came out, LCS member and actual professional linguist Logan posted a video as a specific refutation of our verb banter during the circus.
Identifying the existence of cross-linguistic categories and identifying their exponents in any particular language turn out to be difficult. For example, what's the line between an enclitic and a suffix? Is black box a phrase or a compound? Does Tagalog mark topics or subjects? Does Mandarin have adjectives or just stative verbs? And so on. Fortunately, there is a middle path, comparative non-a-prioristic typology. This point of view recognizes that every language does have its own categories, but the large areas of overlap do exist, and it is useful to reuse terms between languages for different categories that are nevertheless substantially similar in significant ways, as long as we are clear that in doing so we are not implicitly claiming that two different languages are actually exactly the same. In deciding whether or not a particular language has a particular named category, then, we must decide whether it has a category whose functions overlap to a sufficiently large extent with categories in other languages for which we use the same label.
It was a really good video that you should all definitely watch after this. I'll link it in the little corner and spots, right? You should definitely watch it. Logan knows his stuff. Essentially, though, the final thesis of the video was that verb is a term that can mean really whatever we want it to be. The real question is as to whether every language needs both a predicate and an argument to create a grammatical clause. And it seems that there may be a few languages that can deliberately have grammatical clauses with only predicates, but it's a real gray area. So, with all that in mind, yeah, a verb can be whatever you want it to be in your creative project, essentially. It's just a word that humans made up to be more convenient to explain things. If it's easier for you to describe how your language works by putting predicate and argumentative information together in a particular arrangement where the term verb would complicate rather than simplify things, then you, as the sole authority over your own creative project, have technically made a verbless language. But, hypothetically, if someone else sought to create a linguistics paper about the grammar of your language, and in the paper they do indeed define a class of concepts as verbs, then they may very well be correct too. But let's break things down to the basics. Let's see if we can point out why human languages have predicates and arguments, and why it's so helpful to use the word verb to define grammatical items that appear in most of them. And maybe how it can truly be destroyed. Now, before we get too deep into this, I wanted to say thanks to all the ngatrons over on patreon.com/nga and the YouTube members who clicked the join button below. I have a few months left out here in the Basque country, and I'm actually relying on YouTube money for my general survival more than ever before, so I appreciate you all very much for sticking around. I'm hoping to document my thoughts more often on the second channel, the Velar Nasal. So far, I have just put my massive rant about the process of getting out here to Spain on there, which I edited like a normal nga video, but decided to put on the second channel afterwards anyway. So check that out if you're interested. But my setup, my very advanced technology setup right now, will remain non-existent and improvised like this until I return to Arizona in June or July, somewhere around there. So I hope it hasn't been too much of an issue. I know the algorithm hasn't really blessed me as much in the past year as it did in the year before, but let's see if we can get to 20,000 subscribers this year. If you're not subscribed yet, it's free. Click that little subscribe button over there. It won't hurt you. Lots of very horrific things are coming to this channel very soon, so keep yourself updated by hitting the little bell icon and all that. Like the video, comment something to improve the algorithm if you could too. I would appreciate that. If you can't think of anything, just comment, "I'll go rhythm," and I'll know you support the cause. Let's get started. Now, I'm no prescriptivist here to ruin people's fun, so take this as a challenge if you'd like. I'm just going to explain why the information that fulfills the purpose we could describe as verb is almost inevitable. Well, when the universe began, the universe began. Time, it theoretically exists, right? We humans, the brains that create languages naturally or artificially, exist within a matrix of 4 dimensions: length, width, height, and time. This is inescapable. Matter exists, and matter changes. It changes state, position, and relation to other pieces of matter and concepts. And this only matters to those whose survival depends on properly reacting to the existence and change of matter. The matter, the state of the matter at a selected point in time, and the relation sections of matter have is the noun, and the change is the verb. At the most basic core, these are the 2 concepts that are practically necessary to communicate within our reality. Or are they? Defining what a verb is more complicated than one might think. One attempt at a definition that you hear all the time is that verbs denote relations between things or actions or changes of state. Consider, for instance, the sentence, "Caesar conquers Gaul." As we all know, conquers here is a verb. It denotes the action of conquering and establishes a relation between Caesar and Gaul. Now, consider the phrase, "Caesar's conquest of Gaul." Here, conquest denotes the action of conquering, and it too establishes a relation. In fact, the exact same relation between Caesar and Gaul. Yet, conquest, as we all know intuitively, is not a verb. The fundamental problem with defining verbs in terms of something that denotes an action is that it is a semantic definition. As a reminder, semantics is concerned with the meaning of things, whereas syntax is concerned with the structure of things. Parts of speech, such as verb, noun, and adjective, are syntactic properties, so it is not too surprising that a semantic definition ends up being outright wrong. In other words, if we want to talk about what constitutes a verb, we need to do so in terms of its syntactic properties. It turns out that there actually is a definition of verb that works for any language, but it might feel a little bit unsatisfactory. I like to say that a verb is something that behaves like a verb. Well, okay, what is that supposed to mean? Syntactician Andrew Carney defines verbs, or indeed any part of speech, based on 2 properties. The first is a morphological distribution, both derivational and inflectional. Derivational morphology determines the part of speech of a word. For instance, an English word that ends in "-ize", such as advertise, is likely a verb. Note likely here. Clockwise also ends with "-ize", yet it isn't a verb. This shows that one of these properties in isolation might not be enough to figure out what part of speech a certain word is. Inflectional morphology does the opposite. Inflectional affixes don't determine the part of speech. Rather, they only attach to certain parts of speech. For instance, English ing can only attach to verbs, and ly only to adjectives, or adverbs. The second property is syntactic distribution, as in what syntactic position, in particular, next to what other parts of speech does this part of speech usually occur. For instance, English verbs may be followed by adverbs, as in begin quickly. Similarly, nouns may be preceded by determiners such as the, as in the tree, and adjectives, as in the ancient tree. These are constraints. The begin is invalid, right? Because verbs can't occur after determiners, and tree quickly is invalid because adverbs can't modify nouns, only verbs. These two properties, morphological distribution and syntactic distribution, are how we can define verbs, or any part of speech for that matter, for any language. You may have noticed, however, that the rules I just listed for verbs and nouns were all specific to English. For instance, the rule that nouns follow adjectives is true for English, but in Spanish, the ancient tree would be el árbol antiguo, with antiguo, ancient, following the noun. In other words, the exact distribution of parts of speech is unique to every single language, and thus the precise definition of what constitutes a verb is also unique to every language. Wait, so then what does verb mean across linguistically then? Does it mean anything at all? Well, it turns out that verb is a quite useful concept that in most languages have some part of speech that shares properties we commonly associate with verbs. For instance, French verbs inflect for number, tense aspect, person, and mood. So do Spanish verbs, and German verbs, and indeed the verbs of most of the Indo-European languages, as well as many non-Indo-European languages like Hungarian or Arabic. Furthermore, the verbs in these languages are often modified by some other part of speech, commonly called adverbs, and many of them take arguments, often more than one, such as a subject, direct object, indirect object, to which they assign certain roles, and which are usually determiner or noun phrases, prepositional phrases, or entire clauses. Of course, there are other parts of speech that do some of these things, but verbs are the most prominent one. This is what I mean by a verb is something that behaves like a verb. The exact syntactic properties of what any one language would call a verb may differ, but the verbs of most languages are reasonably similar to the point where it makes sense for us to speak of verbs, not just with respect to any one language, but in more abstract, general terms. As an aside, proponents of universal grammar claim that syntax is, in fact, an innate part of human cognition, and that it simply manifests itself differently across languages in a more or less arbitrary way. Whether or not you believe that is up to you, but irrespective of that, establishing verbs as a cross-linguistic concept allows us to come up with a systematic theory of syntax that can account for and even predict the syntactic behavior of many different, often unrelated languages. The closest thing to a true definition of the term verb, then, is that from the point of view of syntax, a verb is anything in a sentence that syntacticians can mangle enough to where it can reasonably be analyzed as ending up in a certain syntactic position, namely the head of a VP, or verb phrase, when written on a syntax tree, such that the structure of the containing sentence or clause as a whole conforms to the rest of the syntactic theory as applicable to other natural languages. In simpler terms, if you could take a sentence in a language and represent it as a syntactic tree that contains a VP, and if the same syntactic model is applicable to most of the rest of the language at least, then congratulations. Whatever the head of that VP ends up being is now a verb, irrespective of what syntactic properties it might have when considered in isolation. So is that it then? Do all languages just have verbs? Well, it's perhaps more accurate to say that most natural languages have something like verbs, but does that truly mean that you can't just make a verbless language? There are actually a few thought experiments that we can pursue here. Now, recall our 2 example sentences about Caesar conquering Gaul earlier. What's interesting is that despite the fact that they are of course different syntactically if you look at the actual phrases involved, the overall high-level structure is actually quite similar. If you're not too familiar with syntax, the terms used in this next part might not mean too much to you, and understanding them isn't actually that important for this, because I think you'll still be able to at least notice the similarities visually. So look at these trees here, and look at the screen. If you're doing this on the side, look at it. See that? In both sentences, we have a subject, that being Caesar, which in both cases is a DP, or determiner phrase, which sits at the top level specifier position of the containing phrase, that is, either spec TP or spec DB in both sentences. In both sentences, there is also an object, that being Gaul or of Gaul, which is the complement of the phrase projected from the predicate, that being conquers or conquest. As in the former case, we have the DP, Gaul, in the complement of the VP, conquers. In the latter, the PP, prepositional phrase, of Gaul, in the complement of the DP, conquest. If that didn't make any sense to you, then don't worry about it. Just know that it's similar. Now, considering this parallel structure, and I admittedly haven't thought too much about the implications of this, but it looks like it would be feasible for there to be a language that doesn't distinguish between those two. That is, a language where Caesar conquers Gaul and Caesar's conquest of Gaul are not just identical in meaning, but rather actually the exact same sentence. If we take this to an extreme, we end up with a language where nouns are indistinguishable from verbs. So does that mean that we now have a verbless language? Probably not. Rather, from a syntactic point of view, at least, we'd end up with a language where even more things are verbs, rather than the other way around, right? Another option would be something that Logan brought up. We could conceivably split the category of a verb into 2 or even more subcategories, each of which has some of the properties of verbs, but which are used in different, if perhaps overlapping contexts. According to some linguists, there are natural languages that do this. At that point, we'd end up with no single thing that we could call a verb. Rather, we'd have different kinds of somewhat verb-like things. We could probably still refer to all of them collectively as verbs, though. This isn't even actually that unusual. Auxiliaries and regular verbs in English, for instance, already have different syntactic properties, but we still refer to both as verbs. In this sense, we'd end up with a language with different kinds of verbs, but it would still have things that we could call verbs, at least collectively. So hopefully now you could see that noun and verb are not necessarily adequate to make up the fundamental elements of language. It's all too subjective. Now, let's take a second to talk about something that might be a little more concrete, maybe? Let's talk about predicates and arguments. So let's start with arguments, because I'm feeling a little edgy today, okay? So an argument is an expression, often a noun or phrase, that is required to form a complete sentence or clause with the predicate. And we'll get to what the predicate is in a moment. In English, the subject of the sentence is an argument, which is required to make a sentence grammatical, usually. What do I mean by this? If we look at an extremely simple English sentence, let's say, I dance. Here, I is a subject argument, and dance, while in this situation a verb by the practical definitions of English linguistics, is, at a more fundamental level, the predicate. Which again, we'll get there, just bear with me, wait. English requires a subject pronoun or a subject noun phrase of some sort, and subject determiner phrase if you're looking at it that way, right? And so, because of that, it's very easy to identify the argument in a basic sentence. In a pro-drop language like Spanish, I dance can be yo bailo, but it's usually just bailo. Even though the information of yo is contained in that suffix at the end of the word, bailo, the first person singular conjugation of that verb, bailar, there is still a defined argument in the one-word clause, bailo. You could consider this split by morphemes, as in the argument is exclusively the o suffix, or you could consider the dropped yo to be a null argument. That is, something that is still there in the syntactic structure of the sentence, but which simply isn't pronounced, not spoken, not said, but it's still there. Either way, the argument in that context exists, and it revolves around something called a predicate. The predicate is generally defined as let's just say the center of gravity around which arguments revolve. Just hear me out. Don't go typing your comments yet. In the framework I was taught at Arizona State University, this includes verbs, direct objects, indirect objects, and any other articles and particles that revolve directly around them. Again, hear me out. And what does this mean? If we look at the sentence, I dance, I is the subject argument, and dance is the predicate. It is the sun to the planet that is the argument, even if that argument is null, right? In the sentence, I dance with her sums up the predicate. But does that mean that everything but the subject/agent of the sentence is by definition a predicate? No, not really. First of all, the components of a predicate can be split up in a couple important ways. Additionally, there are some other planets that can exist in a sentence, but don't need to be there. So this brings us to complements, which seem to be defined slightly differently under different linguistic frameworks. But I'm going to start with what I was taught. Some include both subjects and objects as complements of a verb, framing the main verb in a clause as the true gravitational center, right? Others declare the argument of the predicate to be a complement. For example, in the sentence, he ran to the shelter, or the shelter, depending on whether you want to consider run or run to be the verb. English sucks for these examples. They make up the complement of the predicate. It's easier to interpret it as a phrasal verb, run to, just for your reference. Some syntactic frameworks, such as X-bar theory, have a more precise definition of complement. That being, complement of a phrase is a sister to the head of the phrase. But more generally speaking, a complement is usually seen as something required by the presence of some other element, such as a verb or a preposition, to make the sentence grammatical. Also, in some frameworks, you can distinguish a subject complement from an object complement, depending on the syntactic relation to the subject argument that they take, at least in a language where word order rather than overt grammatical case determines syntactic meaning, that is. With an English copula, for example, you can have subject complements, even if they don't follow the copular verb. In she was a dancer is the subject complement, because in a middle voice sentence, like a simple descriptive or equational copula, she and a dancer are directly linked to one another. A dancer is still specifically a complement because, at least in modern English, a sentence like a dancer was she is kind of weird, though technically in that case, since it's middle voice, she would still be a subject complement in this situation. So, again, English is a mess. Okay. Meanwhile, in a transitive sentence, like our previous example, he ran to the shelter, or the shelter, is an object complement because it is reliant on the verb to exist as it does as a direct object. And if all of that is confusing, just remember, all of this complement business can be contained within the overarching umbrella of just parts of the predicate. if you follow that framework. This is a mess. I can't emphasize enough. This is a mess. Also, there are adjuncts, which can include any part of a sentence that is not necessary for the sentence to be grammatical. If you could strip away a phrase or a clause and the result is still a grammatical clause, then it is probably an adjunct. In "he ran to the shelter in Miami," the phrase "in Miami" is an adjunct in that case. Adverbial phrases are also usually adjuncts as well. Entire clauses can be adjuncts too. In "he ran to the shelter after he locked the door to the house," the phrase "after he locked the door to the house" is all adjunct, essentially, even if you can create an entire grammatical sentence from that clause. But since it is by definition a superfluous optional part of that sentence, it does not need to be considered among the fundamentals. Oh wait, you could strip away "to the shelter" too in that sentence, right? Because "he ran" can exist as an intransitive sentence. Does that mean that "to the shelter" is also an adjunct? No, but there's two reasons why the answer is no. Just because of some of the annoying peculiarities of the English language. First of all, if you interpret the verb "run" as an intransitive verb and "run to" as a separate transitive phrasal verb, then "run to" requires an object argument. The sentence can also be no if you interpret "run" as either an intransitive or transitive verb and "to the shelter" as the optional complement. And exclusively because on a syntax tree, the prepositional phrase is the primordial segment of the clause following the verb. Like, there are no other segments nested within the noun phrase "the shelter." So, at least by the standards of English syntax I learned when I was in university, that could just be called an object argument of a verb that has been declared. In that situation, a transitive verb. Just because, well, okay. It's really more apt to describe "run" and "run to" as just two separate verbs that each have their own theta grid. If you don't know what a theta grid is, that's a whole nother story. I don't think I'm gonna get into it in this video because this is already gonna be an extremely long video. So yeah, it's a mess. This is all kind of just a big mess. It's a bunch of terms, terminology, words that different people have different theories about. We're getting into like the quarks, the subatomic particles of syntax here. We have a long way to go, but hopefully you can already see why this whole question is just a nightmare that's entirely language dependent, situation dependent, framework dependent, and even opinion dependent. Everything I've talked about can fit under the overarching umbrella of constituents as well, even if those constituents are null. Arguments, predicates, everything that could be bracketed together on a branch of a syntax tree is a constituent because they constitute a grammatical utterance. At the core of this, most linguists contend that the base fundamentals are arguments and predicates, and even these are just words. Again, just concepts that humans invented to try and explain the world. It just works a little bit better than using words like noun and verb when discussing the layer of grammar closest to the pure truth that the linguistic academia has been able to agree on so far. One final cursed approach I could think of was to reduce syntax to just predicate logic, at which point all you're left with is predicates, connectives, quantifiers, and variables. At that point, it's basically like a math equation, right? At that point, verbs, nouns, adjectives, and a few other parts of speech all just collapse into predicates. A sentence like, "Fred sees a blue hedgehog," could become, or this logic here, or "There is an X and a Y such that X is Fred and Y is a hedgehog, Y is blue, and X sees Y." Of course, you could split this up differently depending on how much information you want any one predicate to encode. Here, Fred, hedgehog, blue, and sees are all predicates. As in, they each take some number of variables and assign a property to those variables. If you think about this for a bit, you'll notice that the predicates end up expressing everything that verbs normally do and more. In other words, we still haven't really created a verbless language, but rather it might be more accurate to state that now pretty much everything is a verb. It's like saying there are two things, one Freds, the other hedgehogs and blues, and the former sees the latter. The more you think about it, the more just horrific it becomes. And somewhat relatedly, if you make a language that only has a single auxiliary that takes all the inflection, and the main verbs are just uninflected words floating around in the sentence with no semblance of structure to them, a syntactician would likely still analyze those floating words as verbs, because separating inflection from the main verb is basically already what prominent theories of syntax do. For languages with inflected verbs, syntax posits that the inflection and the verb start out as separate and then get merged later on. So a language that doesn't do this and only has a single inflected auxiliary is nothing strange. It essentially just doesn't perform that merge. And finally, let's touch on a fairly well-known example of supposed verblessness, that being that of a zero copula. In some languages, it is possible to drop the is in a sentence such as Fred is a hedgehog, resulting in essentially the equivalent of Fred a hedgehog. Isn't this a verbless sentence? Well, the thing about syntax is that instead of modeling something as entirely absent, we generally prefer to model it as silent or covert or null. That is, it is actually there. You just can't hear it. This may seem very strange at first. How could something be there if it isn't pronounced, right? It's not actually happening, is it? Well, often such null elements are motivated by the effects they have on the surrounding phrase, in that they tend to cause syntactic phenomena that would otherwise appear out of nowhere, but which can be explained fairly well if you posit that there just is something there in the syntactic structure, but it's just silent. In other words, a syntactician would say that a sentence with a zero copula very much does contain a verb. You just can't see it, can't hear it. Another thing to keep in mind is that syntactic theory is just that, a theory. We don't actually know how our brains process language. All we can do is come up with a theory that arrives at the same conclusions. No, not Siri. God damn it. Siri, stop it. All we can do is come up with a theory that arrives at the same conclusions as our brains. That is, what speakers of a language consider ill-formed, the theory should be able to reject, and vice versa. Modeling zero copulas as silent rather than entirely absent achieves this result and is far from the weirdest thing that syntax does. That was a lot, right? It's a lot. So let's recap this a bit. Let's put it all together, put a nice little bow on it. Some people try to define parts of speech by their semantic properties, but this doesn't work because they are fundamentally a syntactic concept. Instead, we can use properties such as distribution, as in the knowledge of what morphemes and other parts of speech are generally adjacent to define parts of speech syntactically. Every language has different rules for this, and thus, in theory, different parts of speech. Cross-linguistically, there is enough overlap between the use of syntactic structure of certain parts of speech in a lot of languages to where it is reasonable to analyze those parts of speech as different flavors of the same underlying concepts. That being verb and noun, and preposition, and so on. As for the concept of creating a verbless language, I don't think it's possible. If you make a language that can be used for human communication, and I'm specifically talking about human communication here, syntacticians will find something about it for which it makes sense to be modeled in some way, shape, or form as a verb, even if you may not interpret those things as verbs yourself. With that out of the way, it should hopefully make sense why it's so easy, so pragmatic, and so effective to describe the properties of a language in terms of nouns and verbs, and why you can technically break out of that barrier into the argument predicate sphere, but not much further than that. And even then, you still have verbs. It's Not that these concepts replace verbs or anything like that. Rather, they are a generalization and serve to describe the structure of not only verbs and adjacent elements, but also of other syntactic elements, such as prepositions and determiners. If you're making a language, you can successfully do so without adjectives or adverbs, but nouns and verbs are almost always going to end up happening. This is because there's no point in communicating if nothing is changing. And humans are good at categorizing objects and concepts and changes in those objects and concepts. To make a language where predicates are truly deleted, you would have to delete change itself. In a reality that only experiences 1 to 3 dimensions, or in other words, one without time, that could possibly happen, but how do you communicate if there is no sending or receiving? Imagine a world where time is frozen and the perspective of a life form is like an omnipotent observer looking around over a paused simulation, like you're in Roblox Studio or something. Nothing is happening. If you're in 3-dimensional space, there are no changes. You could still have a copula, or several different copulas to express the physical position of one thing in relation to another in space, and thus technically have a series of verbs there. If you want to get rid of that verb, you can do so and leave only the prepositions, but there would still be the zero copula, the null, hidden there in the grammatical space. But wait, there's no sending or receiving at all. There can't be communication at all. So there is no declaring even a subject or object. All of the objects in timeless space are completely equal and unable to be described because there is no describing. Maybe if the speakers of this language are several omnipotent observers floating around that timeless Roblox Studio space as observers communicating with one another, but that doesn't work either because that means that at least to them there is time. And the omnipotent speakers are just able to witness some timeless space together and talk about it. Like multiple people have like the world from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure or something, and they're just chatting in an otherwise frozen world. They're still experiencing time. Even Dio said he had 9 seconds of stop time. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean to have 9 seconds of stop time? The same problem persists if you reduce the dimensions of reality to 2 or 1 or even 0. Sure, there's no verbs per se, but that's because there is no communication either. So at the very least, time needs to exist for language to exist. Human language, at least. And for a language to be useful, there has to be a predicate, even if that predicate is a null 0 copula. The relation between the subject and the object is too fundamental to the purpose for and mechanism of communication. So that's pretty much the hard limit, right? That's the reason why we were joking around during the CCC judging. The majority of the cases in the past 3 years where we've been told that a cursed language doesn't have verbs, they simply did by easily definable standards. Others made it past that layer and didn't have verbs in the sense that the majority of natural languages have. They made it to the layer of putting the work of change into the word order or the prepositions or other grammatical elements. If we were to break down each one, most of them, even the 2 conlangs inspired by Darmok, would still have arguments and predicates, and any syntactic analysis of sentences in those languages would still have like a verb phrase, and thus a verb-ish thing at some level. So sure, you could say that your language has just one-word sentences, food, grammar, explosion, but at that point, it's really no different from like a dog having different barks for different situations, or Nimchimsky creating his famous meat eat orange sentence, which I beautifully made into a song for Babalingua a couple years ago. Eat me orange, give me you, eat me you, me, orange you give away. But no syntax means that it's not really grammar anymore. Intelligent utterances? Yeah, but grammar? Not really anymore. So, am I telling you, cursed conlangers, to give up on that dream? Not necessarily. I'm not going to prescribe your reality. Do what you want. All I'm going to say is that I'm not ever going to be making like a verbless language CCC theme, because it's such a Sisyphean philosophical task that most attempts will fail, and I don't feel like actuallying hundreds of creative projects. And if you really want to claim like verblessness in your next cursed project, just know that it's not as simple as excluding a category labeled verb in your conlang documentation. So you better have a damn good syntactic explanation planned if you're really gonna go down that route. So do I have a legendary, nightmarishly cursed, truly predicate-free language to present to you all today? No, not this time at least. Every time I think of it, I just reach the point where the entropy in the universe has to reach like complete equilibrium, and thus nothing happens. It's like dividing linguistic information by 0. As Logan Kearsley mentioned in his video, and as I just explained in detail earlier, you can end up with a language that exists primarily with first-order predicate logic, wherein verbs would be indistinguishable from nouns, in that both just assert a logical predicate. But at that point, it's less of a verbless language and more of an only verbs language. But this is pretty much the bottom of the iceberg, at least for what is comprehensible by a human brain, I think. If I come up with something, that'll be another video, for sure. But just don't count on it. Again, thanks so much to the patrons and members for making this possible. Also, anyone who sent super chats and stuff recently, that legitimately helped me buy meals while I'm out on this non-work authorized student visa on the other side of the world. So thank you very much for that. Stick around for the next few videos. There's some good stuff coming. Very good stuff is coming. You'll see. Until next time, nga is out. Mwah.